Picture three people in the Southern California desert, 6 miles northeast of a town called Olancha, on the edge of the Coso Mountains. The date, by their own account, is the 13th of February, 1961. They run a small gift and gem shop, and they are what people back then called rock hounds, hobbyists who hunt the desert for interesting stones to cut, polish, and sell. Their names come down to us as Wallace Lane, Virginia Maxey, and Mike Mikesell. On that day, they pick up what looks like an ordinary geode, a hollow-looking nodule, the kind you crack open hoping to find crystals inside. The next day, Mikesell takes it to the shop to cut it. And here is the first strange detail, the kind you should hold on to. According to the account, cutting into that stone ruined a diamond saw blade. Whatever was inside was hard enough to wreck the very tool meant to open it. When the nodule finally came apart, there were no crystals. Instead, at the center, they found something that stopped them cold. A perfectly round, hard core. White ceramic, or something that looked like ceramic. And running down the middle of that ceramic, a shaft of bright metal. Now, to understand why this matters, you have to understand what a geode is supposed to be. A nodule like this forms over immense spans of time as minerals slowly fill a cavity in rock, layer by patient layer. If something is genuinely sealed inside such a formation, the assumption is that it was there when the formation began. And the outer material of this particular specimen was said to carry fossil shells and the kind of weathered crust that geologists associate with great age. One estimate that got attached to the story and never let go was that the encasing material was around 500,000 years old. Sit with that number for a moment. 500,000 years ago, by everything we know, there were no cities, no metalworking, no ceramics, no human beings even remotely like us shaping copper and porcelain into machined cylinders. And yet, if the object was truly what it appeared to be, manufactured, precise, made of refined materials, then either the rock was not that old, or something was very wrong with the entire timeline we take for granted. This is exactly the kind of object that a certain group of researchers came to call an OOP art, an out-of-place artifact. A thing that appears in the wrong time, in the wrong layer, in a place it has no business being. And the Coso artifact, as it came to be known, would become one of the most famous of them all. For decades, it has been passed from book to book, from lecture to lecture, held up as evidence that the human story is far stranger and far older than the textbooks admit. If you find yourself drawn to the objects that mainstream history quietly sets aside, the finds that get a footnote and a shrug, then consider subscribing, because this channel spends its time exactly there, at the edges of what we think we know. So here is what we are going to do together. We are going to look closely at what the finders actually claimed and what was actually documented. We are going to examine the X-ray images that turned a local curiosity into an international mystery. We are going to hear the strongest version of the case that this was manufactured technology in impossibly old stone. Then, we are going to turn the object over and look at the other side, what geologists and engineers said when they examined the same evidence. And finally, we are going to look at one specific, ordinary identification that may explain the entire thing, and ask whether the mystery survives it. Because the tension in this story is not really about aliens or lost super-civilizations. The tension is between two honest readings of the same small stone. And to see why so many intelligent people took it seriously, we have to look at the evidence that made this object impossible to ignore. The heart of the Coso mystery is not really the outer nodule. It is what the X-rays seem to show inside. Because the finders did not simply cut the object and declare a wonder. At some point, the specimen was X-rayed, and it is those images that turned a rockhound's curiosity into a decades-long argument. Look at what the X-rays reportedly revealed. Down the central axis of the object ran a shaft of bright metal, the kind of white shadow that dense metal leaves on an X-ray plate. Around that metal core sat a layer of ceramic material, and at one end, the images showed something that looked disturbingly deliberate, a small spring or a helix or a spiral of metal. Not a random blob, a shape that suggested a made thing, an assembled thing, with parts that fit together for a purpose. Now put those features side by side with the outer shell. The finders described a hexagonal cross-section to part of the interior casing. They described the whole assembly as being encased in what looked like hardened clay, and around that, the mineral crust of the nodule itself, complete with what were described as fossil shells embedded in the outer material. So the picture that emerged, layer by layer, was this: a modern-looking machined core, wrapped in ceramic, sealed inside old-looking stone that carried the fingerprints of deep time. And here is the interpretation that gave the object its enduring nickname. To more than one observer, the whole arrangement, a central conductive core, an insulating ceramic sleeve, a metal casing, and that little spring at the top, looked uncannily like a spark plug, the component in an internal combustion engine that delivers the electrical spark to ignite fuel. A ceramic insulator around a central metal electrode is precisely what a spark plug is. So, imagine the collision here. A 20th century engine part, or something that looks exactly like one, apparently entombed in a rock that geology says formed over hundreds of thousands of years. This is the moment the story stops being local and becomes legendary. The finders reportedly consulted a geologist, and the estimate of great age for the encasing material entered the record. Virginia Maxey, one of the three, is often quoted suggesting the object could be around 500,000 years old based on that geological assessment. And once that number attached itself to a thing that looked like a spark plug, the implication was electric. Either an advanced technology existed on Earth 500,000 years ago and left this behind, or the object had come from somewhere else entirely. For a while, the specimen was even reportedly offered for sale, and there was talk of the Smithsonian showing interest. Whether that interest was ever formal is one of those threads that gets harder to verify the harder you pull on it. What is clear is that the artifact caught the attention of people who wanted it to be extraordinary. It was written up, it was photographed, it was drawn in cross-section, and crucially, the original object itself, according to most accounts, eventually vanished from public view. What survives, more than anything, are those X-ray images and the descriptions built around them. Watch how the case builds when you line the features up. The metal core suggests conductivity. The ceramic suggests insulation. The spring suggests an assembled mechanism. The hexagonal casing suggests machining, deliberate geometry, not natural crystal growth. And the fossil-bearing crust suggests age. Take those 5 observations together, and it is easy to see why serious, curious people looked at this and felt the ground shift. No single feature proves anything, but stacked together, they seemed to describe a manufactured device in a geological setting that made no sense. And then came the detail that pushed it further still. Someone reportedly noticed, in the imagery, faint traces that suggested the metal core might not be solid, that there could be corrosion or a change in the material, consistent with metal that had been sitting for a very long time. To those inclined to believe, this was the clincher. Not just a machined object, but a machined object that appeared to have aged inside its stone tomb. So we are left with a small nodule that seems to contain a modern electrical component, wrapped in ceramic, sealed in rock, carrying the marks of 500,000 years. On its face, that is impossible. One of those readings has to be wrong, unless, somehow, neither of them is. And to find out which, we have to stop admiring the object and start interrogating it. Because the moment you begin asking hard questions, the tidy picture starts to loosen. And the first thing that troubles a careful investigator is not the object at all, it is the age. Here is the problem with that famous number. 500,000 years rests entirely on the assumption that the outer nodule is a true geode, a slow mineral formation that took ages to build. But not everything that looks like a geode is one. In dry desert environments, minerals dissolved in groundwater can accumulate around a buried object surprisingly fast, cementing sand, clay, iron oxide, and debris into a hard concretion. A concretion. That is the key word skeptics kept returning to. It looks like an ancient nodule. It can even trap small shells or fragments in its crust. But it can form around a modern object in decades, not millennia. And that reframes everything. If the encasing material is a concretion rather than a genuine geode, then the age of the crust tells you nothing about the age of the thing inside. The object could be old, or it could be an ordinary item dropped in the desert that simply gathered a stony coat over a few decades of chemistry. The 500,000-year figure, remember, was never a laboratory measurement in the way it was often repeated. It was an estimate tied to an assumption about what kind of rock this was. So, skeptics pressed further. If this really is a manufactured object, they asked, then let us not treat it as a mystery from nowhere. Let us identify it. And this is where the case takes its sharpest turn. Because in the 1990s, a member of a fossil and mineral society took a serious interest in the Coso artifact and did something that, in hindsight, seems obvious. He and his colleagues compared the X-ray images and the described features not to alien technology, not to some lost civilization, but to a very specific, very mundane catalog: American spark plugs from the 1920s. And the match, according to their analysis, was strikingly close. The ceramic insulator, the metal core, the shape of the casing, the little spring or metal cap at the top, all of it lined up with a particular style of spark plug manufactured by a well-known American company in that era. The hexagonal feature, the layered structure, the internal geometry, none of it required an impossible explanation once you accepted that this was a decades-old, not eons-old, engine part. Now, I want to be honest and careful here, because this is exactly the kind of place where a story like this gets oversold in both directions. The skeptics did not have the original object in a laboratory, cut open and dated by independent teams. Most of what everyone has been arguing about, on both sides, are the old X-ray images and the finder's descriptions. So the identification as a 1920 spark plug is an interpretation too. A very strong one, a very ordinary one, but an interpretation built on the same limited evidence. And that is the honest tension. The believers looked at those features and saw a manufactured device in ancient stone. The skeptics looked at the same features and saw a manufactured device in a fast-forming concretion, which means no mystery at all, just an old car part in the desert. Both are reading a machine into the image. The disagreement is entirely about the age of the rock around it. So, which reading holds up better? Ask yourself what is more likely: that an advanced technology existed 500,000 years ago, left behind a single component identical to a mass-produced part from the 1920s, and then vanished without a single other trace anywhere on Earth? Or that a spark plug from a Model T-era engine was lost in the California desert, buried in mineral-rich soil, and grew a stony crust that a hopeful rockhound later mistook for an ancient geode. When you frame it that way, the ordinary explanation is not just possible, it is overwhelmingly more probable. And yet, and this is why the story never fully dies, a few threads still hang loose. The original object disappeared, so no one today can put it under a modern scanner. The claim that the metal core showed signs of long corrosion was never resolved by independent testing, and the finders, by all accounts, genuinely believed they had something extraordinary. They were not con artists staging a hoax. They were hobbyists who cut open a rock and found something that, in the moment, looked impossible. So the question sharpens rather than dissolves. If this is just a spark plug, why does it still haunt us? What is it about this small, ordinary object that made so many people want it to be more? To answer that, you have to bring the two lines of this story together and look at what they share. On one side, the deep time reading, a machined device in 500,000-year-old stone. On the other, the mundane reading, a 1920 spark plug in a decades-old concretion. And here is the thing that unites them. The observation that should give everyone pause on both sides. Everyone agrees on what the object is. A manufactured item with a ceramic insulator and a metal core, assembled by human hands in a factory. Nobody, not even the boldest believer, argued this was a natural mineral formation. The entire fight was never about whether it was made. It was only about when. And that is what makes the Coso artifact such a clean, almost perfect example of how a mystery is really built. It is not built from a single impossible fact. It is built from one true observation. This is a manufactured object, laid on top of one unverified assumption. This rock is ancient. Remove the assumption, and the object goes right back into the 20th century where it comfortably belongs. The whole edifice of wonder rested on that one geological premise, and that premise was the weakest link in the chain. Now bring in the physical reality of the place, because the setting matters more than it first appears. The Coso region of California is not some sealed, undisturbed prehistoric vault. It is desert country that has seen mining, prospecting, off-road travel, and human activity for well over a century. It is exactly the kind of landscape where an engine part could be lost, half buried, and forgotten. And the desert chemistry, mineral-laden groundwater, dramatic wet and dry cycles, iron-rich soils, is precisely the environment where concretions form around buried objects. So the geography does not deepen the mystery, it quietly explains it. The very ground that was supposed to prove great age is the same ground that manufactures the illusion of it. And look at what happened to the strongest piece of evidence. The estimate of 500,000 years came by the accounts from a look at fossil shells and weathering in the crust. But fossil shells in desert sediment can be far older than the concretion that later cemented them together. A concretion can scoop up ancient fragments and bind them into a young rock. So the presence of old shells in the crust does not date the object. It only tells you what materials were lying around when the crust formed. That single confusion between the age of the ingredients and the age of the mixture is the entire mystery in miniature. Here is where the two independent lines seem at last to point at the same thing. The believer's careful cross-section drawing and the skeptic's 1920 spark plug catalog are describing the same features, feature for feature. When two people who disagree about everything end up drawing the same object, that convergence is telling you something. It is telling you the object is real, ordinary, and identifiable. The only place they diverge is the one place no one could test, the true age of the surrounding stone. And the moment you apply the more ordinary, better supported reading of that stone, the two lines collapse into a single, unremarkable answer. So the honest verdict, the one the weight of evidence supports, is this. The Coso artifact is almost certainly a spark plug from the early decades of the 20th century, lost in the desert and encased over a few decades in a mineral concretion that a rockhound understandably mistook for an ancient geode. That is not a lost technology. It is a lost engine part, and the far more human mystery of how eager we are to see wonder in stone. But I want to be precise about the edge of what we can claim, because that edge is the real story. We cannot put the original object under a modern instrument because the original object is gone. We are all, believers and skeptics alike, arguing over old X-ray plates and secondhand descriptions. So the spark plug identification, strong as it is, remains an inference. It is the best explanation, it is the one that requires no impossible assumptions and matches a real cataloged product. But it has never been sealed by a laboratory with the artifact in hand. And that small, honest gap is exactly the crack through which the legend keeps breathing. And that gap is worth sitting with because it tells us something about ourselves that outlasts any single stone. Think about what actually happened here. 3 ordinary people cut open a rock, found a made thing inside, and reached almost instantly for the most extraordinary explanation available. Not the lost car part, the lost civilization. And they were not fools. That reflex, that hunger to find that the past was deeper and stranger than we were told, is one of the most human things there is. We want the world to have hidden rooms. We want the stone to remember something the textbooks forgot. And here is the uncomfortable, beautiful truth this little object teaches. The mistake was not in wondering. The mistake was in skipping a step, in taking the age of the rock as given, when the age of the rock was the one thing no one had actually established. The believers were right about one thing all along. This was a manufactured object, and it was genuinely surprising to find it there. They just reached for the ending before checking the middle. And that is a lesson that applies to far more than one spark plug in a California geode. Every time you meet a claim that some object is out of place, out of time, impossible, the real question is almost never about the object. It is about the assumption sitting quietly underneath it, the one no one thought to test. That is the value of an artifact like this. Even after it turns out to be ordinary, it teaches you the method. It teaches you to separate the observation from the assumption. To ask not is this manufactured, but how do we actually know how old the rock is? To notice the load-bearing premise in any wonder and press on it gently until it either holds or gives way. And if you ever crack open a stone in the desert and find a made thing looking back at you, remember the Coso artifact before you decide what century you are holding. I would genuinely like to hear your take on this one, because it sits right on the line. Do you find the spark plug explanation as convincing as I do, or does that missing original object, the one no one can test anymore, leave just enough room for doubt in your mind? And more broadly, what other famous out-of-place artifacts do you think deserve this same careful, honest second look? Tell me in the comments. I read them, and the best conversations on this channel always happen down there. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the ones where we take a wild claim seriously, weigh it fairly, and follow the evidence wherever it actually leads, then consider subscribing, because there are stranger and better ones still to come. And if this held your attention all the way to the end, a like really does help more curious people find it, which is the whole reason a channel like this can keep going. Thank you for staying with me through the whole thing. Keep asking what the assumption is before you accept the wonder, and I will see you in the next one.